All right, so as we get started, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kate Semino, and I serve as Executive Director of the Citizens League. I am really pleased to be able to be here with you today to have a great conversation on a really important question. How do I talk to my neighbor again? And we have some fantastic folks with us in the room and some great conversations ahead on this topic. So as a little intro, I suspect that many of you know about the Citizens League, but if this is your first Citizens League event, I will tell you just a teensy bit about who we are and what we do. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we believe in the power of people to be involved in both understanding public policy issues and helping shape great solutions and being involved in that process. And so we do this through educational events like these, paid internships for students of color that we and Indigenous students at the state capitol, as well as participatory processes like study committees and policy work groups and research projects that we host or convene at the Citizens League and do with partners and other collaborators. We are based in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, and we work statewide. And we've been at this for nearly 70 years. The Citizens League has been around for many decades and excited for what's ahead. We are really grateful for the partnership and support of so many friends and collaborators over the years, and always looking for new partners and new people to connect with. So thank you again for being here. We are at a mind opener, and this is a series that Citizens League has done for quite some time. This is our one of our longtime series of learning events that we host as a way to open doors for people to explore and learn about different policy issues and just have really good conversations. So we don't consider this to be a debate. We consider it to be a deeper exploration. And I want you to know that we're using our chat today. If you want to put a question or a comment in the chat, you can feel free to do so. And we're going to get to as many of our questions as we can. I do want to thank those of you who, at the point of purchasing or at the point of getting your ticket for this event, if you made an additional gift in support of Citizens League's work and in support of Mind Openers specifically, I want to thank you for that. Again, we are a nonprofit, and so your gift really helps support our work and make our work possible. For Mind Opener, we have a fantastic partner on this series, and that is Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota. And they have been our longtime partner, great thought partner, and supporter and sponsor of this series. And we're just really thankful to Blue Cross Blue Shield for helping us bring this series to a really broad audience. And so I want to welcome and thank Bridget Callahan, who's here from Blue Cross Blue Shield, and turn over to you, Bridget, to say hello and share about Blue Cross's interest in this event.
Great, thanks so much, Kate. Hi, everyone, Bridget Callahan. I'll say we've been partnering with Citizens League for, I think, about 30 years and are really thrilled to be sponsoring the Mind Opener series and today's event, exploring healthy conversations in an era of hyper-polarization. I'll say that at Blue Cross, we really believe that community health is shaped by the strength of civic spaces, like the Citizens League, and civic participation as well. You know, this topic is so important to us because we internally at Blue Cross have a civic engagement program that works with employees to find ways to do just this, promote dialogue and understanding, bridge divides across political differences. And that's not only a part of our civic engagement work, but also aligns closely with the goals of our talent and culture and HR teams to make everyone feel welcome and encourage employees to be able to bring their whole selves to work. In line with today's topic, I also just wanted to mention that the other side of this conversation about social isolation is a health concern, and one that we have to address, and it only becomes more challenging in a hyperpolarized society. I just learned recently that nearly 70% of our Medicaid and Medicare members report experiencing social isolation, which makes it the top social determinant of health issue reported by members. So more than food insecurity or lack of transportation or things like that. So, at Blue Cross, we see that as part of our responsibility to address some of those issues too, all in the name of health. So whether it's encouraging social support through our benefits, providing resources to caregivers, things like that, it's a really important issue. So with that, I'm looking really forward to today's conversation and learning how we can all get better at talking to our neighbors again, whether that's in our personal lives or at the office as well. So thanks to the Citizens League, and back to you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Bridget, and thank you, Blue Cross. I appreciate hearing more about how you're thinking about this topic at Blue Cross and with your communities that you work in, so thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce a few colleagues now, and so I'd like to introduce Blanca Martinez Gavinia, who is our Citizens League Director of Public Policy, as well as Kate Wagner, who is one of our interns this semester from University of St. Thomas. And Blanca will be opening up and guiding us through this conversation. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Kate, for the introduction. And thank you everyone who took time from their very busy days to be here with us. I want to start by acknowledging an amazing feedback that we got from one of our community members, in which they talked about our title, How Do I Talk to My Neighbor Again? And their suggestion was, why wouldn't we change the title to How Do I Talk with My Neighbor Again? Which again proves the point that language is really important. And as we talk through these topics that are really, really critical, we want to keep in mind, what is language? How can we speak with language that is more inclusive, with language that helps us feel seen, with language that can be empowering? So with that, I am so excited to introduce our two panelists today. So first we have with us Minister JaNaé Bates, and they are the Communications Director for Faith in Minnesota, ISAIA, multiracial, multi-faith, statewide vehicles for people and communities of faith, Black-owned barbershops and childcare centers. These organizations are dedicated to building a multiracial democracy by moving collectively and powerfully for racial and economic equity in the state of Minnesota. JaNaé specializes in integrating grassroots community organizing and narrative strategy. She has been instrumental in the implementation of the race-class narrative framework in both Minnesota and across the US. JaNaé is a womanist theologian and a Fulbright scholar. She has over a decade of academic and professional experience in ministry, social justice, and communications. Today, we also have Professor Howard Lavine, who is an Associate Dean of the Social Sciences in the College of Liberal Arts of Arleen C. Carlson, Professor of Political Science and Psychology. His work centers on the psychological underpinning of mass political behavior. He is the author of Open versus Closed: Personality, Identity, and the Politics of Redistribution, The Ambivalent Partisan: How Critical Loyalty Promotes Democracy, and the editor of The Feeling Thinking Citizen and Political Psychology. He has published articles in the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, among many others. He is in the past editor of the Journal for Political Psychology and current editor of the journal Advances in Political Psychology. His current work focuses on human rights, populism, partisan asymmetries, and the intersection of race and political context on public opinion. So as you see today, we're gonna have a very robust conversation. So let's start with the first question, which is, can you please share your background and why this issue is of importance to you? And JaNaé, we'll start with you.
All right. I am super honored to get to talk on this panel, and most certainly really grateful to be like co-doing this with you, Howard. This is great. So my background, as you all heard, I'm a minister. I'm a Christian minister, and just like at the flat-face core of it, it really matters to me that we are in a place where we're able to communicate with one another, where we're in a place where we can have fruitful, healthy dialogue, because that's where we get to grow as human beings. And again, as a person of faith, I think the whole point and purpose of us being here on this planet is about us being reconciled to one another. And so it is incredibly important for me and for folks like me to be able to think about and implement ways for us to open up to one another, to talk with one another. And of course, in this political arena, it feels harder and harder. And so, as Blanca had mentioned, I have been one of the core implementers here in the state of Minnesota, but also been doing this work across the US of implementing something called a race, class, gender narrative. And it is a framework where we have done a lot of research, over the past 5 to 6 years that has really been dedicated to this notion of how can we tap into the best version of people? How do we get people to a place where they're ready to talk about collective action, collective decision-making that benefits a big collective we? And what we have shown is that a huge thing is we cannot continue to have economic populist conversations without talking about race, without talking about class, without talking about gender, and how those are intricately tied, and also the ways in which race especially is used as wedges in community. But what we've also discovered is that the very, very large swath of people are actually really excited and ready to have conversations about unity, about community, about racial equity and collective prosperity, and that there are very particular ways in which we can have those conversations that are different than what we, I think, naturally tend to do. So I get to do that work and implement it in the world. And I get to leverage like really smart people's work, like Howard's, but like linguists and researchers who are thinking about the psychology of this. And I get to train people on how to do it every day. So.
Thank you so much, JaNaé. Howie, to you.
Oh, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me, Blanca and JaNaé. It's great to be here with you, and I just love what you said. And I'm on the sort of the maybe if we can distinguish between I guess the academic side and the practicing side. I'm on the academic side. I'm a political science professor with a PhD in psychology, and I'm a political science professor at the University of Minnesota. And my work over the past 2 decades or more, really, I'm getting old, focuses largely on the origins of public opinion and the psychological origins and how they have, well, I guess how we have become so polarized. So polarization has kind of overtaken pretty much everybody in my field, and we all have to grapple with it. And some of us kind of bracket it off because we're studying something else, but it really is part and parcel of what I do. It's a multi-variant and multifarious, phenomenon, and it can be attacked in any number of ways academically. I think a lot of what people are interested in going forward is how to reduce it. So at the outset of the beginnings of polarization among elites, that is people, members of Congress, the view of political scientists was that this was a good thing. And so early in about 1950, there was a political science task force that had decided the parties were too indistinct, and that citizens couldn't judge, they couldn't decide how to make good political decisions because the parties were essentially ideologically too similar to one another, and that parties ought to be, in the words of this task force, responsible. Responsible meaning providing distinctive ideological agendas to the public, to allow the public to think more ideologically and to think more in sync with political elites. And I think the sense of whether this is a good or bad thing has shifted over time to, this has gotten way, way out of control. We didn't anticipate quite how tribal we would become as people, so that we're not looking at each other as political opponents, but we're looking at each other as personal enemies or group enemies that spills over out of politics and into ordinary people's daily lives. And so the last thing I'll just say is I taught a course in the fall called Why Are We So Polarized? Understanding the Other Side. and I've only deepened my interest in this topic. And I'm just delighted to be here and welcome the questions and the answers and the conversation.
Thank you so much. So the next question, and Kate is going to be dropping the link to this research study, and I'll give out some numbers, and you can actually click on the link to follow me with some of these numbers. But the Pew Research states that today, 92% of Republicans are on the right of the median Democrat. And 94% of Democrats are to the left of the median. So what does this mean? And how does it impede with our ability to understand one another? And I'll switch things around. So Howie, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Okay, let me just restate what that really means. It means that the public has become politically divided. Now, I think what's really important to understand is how the public has become politically divided. And it really shapes our entire understanding about its nature and implications. And so let me talk about the origins of how this happened. So political elites began to divide in the late 1970s. And without kind of going into a history of why that was, citizens were not, divided in that way. And so we have a median, if you can think of kind of a bell-shaped curve. Republicans and Democrats were sort of distributed indistinctly across the left and the right. So you had, for example, in foreign policy, Democratic hawks and doves and Republican hawks and doves. You had social conservatives in each party, economic conservatives, liberals in each party. And the Pew Research findings they're really stark. I mean, I haven't seen anything quite that stark, but let's take it at face value and to say, how did that come about? And so the way that we think in political science this has largely come about is through something we call partisan cue taking. And that really means that we are simply willing to follow the party label, that is the party that we identify with, wherever that party wants to go. And so we're not forming preferences in a way that's outside of this partisan vortex. We are expressing our identities through policies that really, to our own minds, or at least to the minds of analysts who study this, are quite arbitrary, meaning that if the parties took a different configuration of opinions, we would simply adopt those as well. So the problem isn't that we're really divided by crystallized differences in our beliefs about the best policies to bring about the common good or any other desired outcome, but rather we're just simply following the parties in ways that reflect the social groups that we belong to. Now that's an added component, and I'll just maybe talk a second about that. And that is that our political party affiliations used to say very little about the underlying social identities that we carry with us. Now that's not the case. And so to be Republican means, for example, to be white, to be religious, to be rural, to be non-college educated, and to be male and to be married. And so we're largely defending social identities that have always mattered. And it's a game about winning, and it's a game about holding an identity that gratifies our self-esteem, our feelings of belongingness, and our desire to reduce uncertainty about the world. And it's much less about what it appears to be on its face, which is our differences in actual public policy commitments or policy beliefs.
Thank you so much, JaNaé.
Yeah, I love that you lifted that up, Howie, because so what we are seeing in race class narrative research is, well, one big distinction from like race class narrative gender research, as opposed to your usual political research, is that political research is very like immediately and explicitly dividing people up by parties. And race class narrative actually wanted to do it differently because, as you can all imagine, and what Howard just named, our actual political party identity and partisanship doesn't really define us completely ideologically. So it doesn't tell you a lot about values. It kind of starts to give you a sense of that, but not completely. So what race class narrative does is we actually divide people up into 3 different groups. And it's what we call base, opposition, and persuadables. And so, I want to be clear that, again, with this particular research, we went out to figure out how do we have conversations with people where we can fully and openly talk about race, class, gender, and come to a healthy consensus, healthy unity. So there is most certainly a bias in that nature, which I'd argue it's a bias in all research. There is some kind of bias, and we just state it more explicitly, right? So, and so the things that we have learned, and it actually does align pretty closely to the Pew research, in terms of what they're saying, that there are these very static and stark folks on the ends of spectrums that at some point started at 10% left and right, and now have grown to 20%, which is alarming and stark, as was named. Well, in what we've learned in Minnesota through this research that we do, we probably redo it every year or so. That nationwide, it is true. It's about 25, it's between 20 and 25%, depending on the state. In the state of Minnesota, we're at about 22% in each of these groups. So what we call base and what we call opposition. And the way that we arrived to who these groups were is we broke them up based on 3 questions around their ideological standpoint on wealth, on the role of government, and on race. So just very quickly, base would strongly believe that government should be used to create opportunities. Opposition believes that government should get out of the way of people to have opportunities. Base believes that wealth is largely a product of circumstances. Opposition believes that it's an individual effort that builds wealth. And base believes that people of color face greater hardship than white people. And opposition rejects this need to tackle racism, and that we've also shifted too far on equity around gender, right? But then this big whopping group of people in the middle that we tend to call moderates, individual, the reality is persuadables tend to hold 2 ideologies at the same time. It's not that they just toggle back and forth. It's actually that a bold message said repeatedly and said with confidence are the things that actually have them basically, they're what we call the good point people. That's a good point. That's a good point too, right? And we know people like that all the time. And those folks are Democrats. Those folks are Republicans. Those folks voted for Trump. Those folks voted for Obama. They're all over. And oftentimes we'll say, oh, this person did this thing, or that's how they vote. And so I don't want them in my camp, or that's not who, is with me. But we actually misqualify them quite often. And once we get clear about that, we can actually start to have these values-driven conversations that make more room for where we want to go.
Thank you. Thank you. And one of the things that I really do hear and resonate is just going back to the basics of how are these values shared. And this next question really speaks to what both of you mentioned in terms of how it is that people are identifying themselves and how they are putting themselves in social groups, and kind of that sense of belonging is really what matters in a lot of these conversations. So if we are aligning mostly our friends or family or some of our co-workers and people in our community, if we're mostly aligning with people that are an echo chamber that really share our views, how it is that we can connect with others that think differently from us? What are some of the spaces, and how do we do that when we have these kind of almost natural sense to connect and to be and belong with those that think like us? And I'll start with you, Howie.
Sure. Yeah, Blanca, this is just a great question. It really gets to the heart of what we need to do to repair society, given just how torn up we all seem to be. So first, I'd like to say that I think while we are in echo chambers, a lot of the research, really nearly all of it, suggests that we have incompletely homogeneous, politically homogeneous social networks, that we live, that is, with in some degree of diversity of viewpoint. That may be within the family, that may be with friends, it may be at the office, but that we're all hearing the other side to a degree. So the problem isn't so much that we're not hearing it. I think, and again, I'm speaking really for the mainstream of my discipline, which I'll call political psychology, which is sort of the intersection of psychologists interested in politics and political scientists who are interested in psychological explanations. And that is the motivation to claim a social identity. And when we claim social identity, there are generally three motivations that underlie it. The first one is that we want our identities to be different and better. So I call this positive distinctiveness. So if we have a social identity, it can be any identity. It can be, so the original research that was conducted in Britain on this was you were either someone who overestimated the number of jelly beans in a jar versus you were someone who underestimated the number. Anyway, so completely meaningless. And what they found in these minimal intergroup studies was that people began to favor those who were, co-overestimators, co-underestimators. And of course, when you bring in, much more deep-lying social identities related to race, class, gender, urban versus rural, educated, less educated, or college educated, non-college educated, you're going to be dealing with people who have a stake in the distribution of dignity and respect in society. And so those things now have become intertwined with a game of competing partisan identities. And so the desire is to believe that our group is different from and better than the other group, which really subsumes under the underlying social identities. So that's a motivation. We want to feel good about ourselves, and we feel good about ourselves based not only on who we think we are individually, but the social identities that we claim for ourselves. Secondly, the world is complex. We don't quite know what to believe, but our social groups and the political parties that kind of lie on top of them explain the world. This is why we have this problem. And then third, we crave belonging at a level that is above that of, say, for example, the nuclear family or a small friendship group, but somewhat smaller than the national group. And so we want to feel like we belong to an entity that is greater than ourselves. And so these are the motivations that have created difficulties in seeing other people as simply people who have different beliefs about, the best way to increase, social cohesion and happiness. Rather, we have become motivated by these motivations to see them as enemies and as dangerous and as inferior, which is hugely worrying. Sorry for my verbosity.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard. I think it's really important. And I'll repeat that question. We're trying to post them as we ask them. So that question again, JaNaé, is how can we connect with people with opposing views when our friends or family or communities are very much reflective of how we think, how we feel? How do we get out of this echo chamber?
Yeah. So the big thing that we found is actually building a memory muscle around this framework that I'm naming, where we actually start with a value when we're having conversations with people. And so it sounds very small, and maybe even like, oh, that's common sense to some of us. But the reality is in most conversations, especially if they become political in any sense, or if they're grounded in this notion of identity or like ideological sides, we usually start with a problem. We start with what's going wrong, what's bad, what's not happening fairly, what's, that is like how we will naturally talk about these things. And it is extremely off-putting, even to people who would ideologically agree with you. Like, again, a lot of those folks that are like in that base group, they're also not necessarily excited about talking about it all the time, right? There's also a subset group in there that are called activists, both in base and opposition, and they are excited to talk about politics all the time. But most of us are not. And so when you're actually leaning into shared values that most people tend to hold around, like care, around safety, around community, around family, Minnesotans especially, we have 3 top values that come up time and time again. It's family. It is the golden rule. So this notion of treating others as you want to be treated, and getting along. And now all of these sound beautiful and lovely, but they also have a double-edged sword, right? And can come up in nasty ways depending on how they're wielded. So we also know, for example, like getting along sounds great, but we also found that, you know, if you are a Somali woman who wears a hijab in certain areas of St. Cloud, you naturally do not get along just by your identity, by your presence, right? So there's ways that can show up differently. But if you start with the shared value, we know that is most certainly the best way to kind of disarm most people, especially that big giant group of folks that I said are like in this imaginary middle, right? And then we talk about, and if you are actually wanting to have like a substantive conversation with folks, because that's the difference. Like if you're just asking, how do you just talk to people? Just talk about values all day. We can talk puppies, rainbows, and unicorns as much as you want. And most folks are cool with that. But if you actually do want to have like a substantive conversation that leans them, it's not even necessarily persuasive, but just to kind of get a shared grounding, then you can, at that point, go from your values to what we call the villains or the violation. And that's where you name explicitly what is happening, right? So I would never recommend anyone say racism is the reason that things are bad, right? Instead, actually say what you mean. Who is the person? Who is the entity? And how are they dividing us, using race strategically to divide us so that we don't agree on an issue, so that we don't work together to have like the shared community we can have. And then you go back to the vision of what we can have together when we fully lean into our values, when we reject the fear, the harm that's being used to divide us or create wedges or scapegoating. So it's that values, villains, vision framework that is part of like the larger RCN or race class narrative. But it has been a proven way for us to be able to have conversations that can move us toward healthy spaces.
Thank you so much for that. And one thing I did want to follow up on is one comment that was made by our intern, currently in college, that there are naturally some spaces where you find yourself in classrooms, in clubs, where you find yourself with people that you don't think alike. You have classmates that may think differently from you, but are there any naturally occurring spaces? And is this really an issue that impacts all generations the same way? Is this something that we're mostly seeing, let's say in some generations? How is this impacting across generations and within generations?
Okay. Well, I think we have some agency in creating our own social networks. And so I think, for those of us that are not interested in politics, our social networks tend to be fairly heterogeneous, and we end up talking to people across the political spectrum. But because we're not that interested in politics, politics doesn't come up a lot, except during presidential elections. And so those people that aren't that interested in politics, a lot of the work that I've done has shown that those tend to be the citizens that are most responsive to the political environment, and they're the most responsive to those to arguments that might be different from those that they currently hold. And that is, their social identities are not linked to their partisan group. They might be linked to something else, right? And they might be as rigid and intolerant about that other social identity, but it's just simply not politics. And so perversely, the people who are creating the most trouble are those of us that are the most engaged. And so it's very difficult to have engagement without strong partisanship. So we don't have people who are both engaged and interested in politics and open-minded at the same time. And that's the problem. So the space, to answer your question, Blanca, the space is among those people that are less interested in politics. Now that's a problem simply because they are less likely to vote and less likely to to sort of move our democracy in one direction or another. But they are people that have very many fewer problems having open-minded discussions with other people.
Thank you so much, JaNaé.
Yeah, I mean, as was named, most certainly we find that birds of a feather flock together. So we tend to have more homogenous groups. And even in this Pew study that was shared, it was said that when, and this was more in in partisan language, but we see this, of course, when I was naming like base and opposition, that folks who are Republican they don't value as much. And I think they were at like a 20% of Republicans value living in diverse communities, racial and ethnic diverse communities, whereas 76% of Democrats find that to be an important thing to have. On the inverse, Republicans at 56% think that it's really important to live in communities that have a similar religious background of you, whereas it's like only 11% for Democrats, right? And so it is true that Republicans tend to lean more towards even more so being homogenous communities, even more so wanting their closest friend groups and family members to also be Republican. And Democrats just a smidgen more open-minded. And I'm like, I want to be clear, I'm talking about like the far end 20% on the spectrum of these folks is where that tends to come in. But what we've also seen on things like issues, that there are most certainly generational gaps. What we have found is that usually Republicans and people in that opposition group that I was naming before, which again is not the same as Republicans, but they tend to skew older. It's usually men. They're usually white, and it's usually over 50. And then under 50s would be more in that base group. And so we see this cut across things like paid family medical leave, who's leaning where. We see the same thing happen with free universal childcare, and a whole series of issues, as you can imagine. So yes, most certainly there are groupings that tend to more naturally occur.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to get into some of the questions that are more of the meat of the conversation, which is what is actually happening in our bodies. I know that for me, I can become very emotional. I tend to cry when I get into these conversations and I have just this opposing perspective and I'm trying hard to get my point across, and then I just kind of shut down. So can we talk a little bit as to what is physically happening in our bodies or brain reactions when we're engaging in these conversations? And how can we navigate these natural reactions that are happening so maybe that we can better connect with folks? And go ahead, Howie.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I really like this question because to my mind, it asks the question, how can we address the problems caused by polarization given how the mind works? So how does the mind work? Politics and anything else, but the mind works simply by something we call the automatic activation of affect. And it's a somatic intuition. So that show somebody a picture of something, name something, and people will have an automatic reaction to it within 200 to 300 milliseconds, sometimes even 100 milliseconds or less. Before we recognize what the object is, we can say whether it's good or bad. So that's how the mind has evolved to work, at least in the minds of those who study how the mind works. And the idea then is that once we know something is good or bad, and that's something that comes from our bodies and hits the top of our heads very quickly, we might be asked, why do you feel that way? At that point, we are simply taking educated guesses about why we feel the way that we feel. We are justifying, these are not reasons, these are rationalizations. Okay? And so that's a big part of, I think, the picture as well, is that a lot of the way that we feel is a function of the accumulation of experience such that we automatically react to things in ways that are uncontrollable and unintentional. And the only way really, from this perspective, the only way to change our minds then is not through arguments or facts. And so you say, well, you're in favor of capital punishment, and you think capital punishment, it provides a deterrent to violent crime. Well, here are some studies that show the opposite. Okay, well, now I'm still in favor of capital punishment for another reason. So clearly they weren't in favor of it for the reason that they gave, right? This is all, we're all familiar with this. And, JaNaé, you're nodding your head. And it's nobody's going to win a Nobel Prize for this, except that the idea of it is so powerful that we've come to learn that the only way to change somebody's mind is by hitting their intuitions. And the way to do that is through something we call evaluative conditioning or conditioning, meaning that you have to pair something good with the opinion that you would like them to take over and over and over and over again, so that the automatic activation of feelings, of affect, of intuition that occurs as a process that you can't control becomes different. That intuition becomes different. And maybe just the simple point to make is that facts don't do it. Facts do not change our intuitions. And so we need to find other ways of doing that. And just to say one way, and this comes straight out of Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, is simply to get people to like you. So, if you're arguing with somebody and they like you, they're much more likely to change their minds. And the way that we think that that's happening is their intuitions change because they are pairing in their minds what you're saying with the fact that they have positive feelings toward you in that moment.
Thank you, Howie. JaNaé?
Yeah, I with this question, I really lean towards some of the great thinkers around this who do psychotherapy. And there's a psychopsychologist here that we're blessed with in Minnesota, but nationwide known, named Resmaa Menakem, who wrote a brilliant book, My Grandmother's Hands. I absolutely love it. And it's all about this notion of the fact that our bodies really hold a lot of our trauma, and that it's something that we actually hold for generations. And so I, recognize that I have trauma responses sometimes when I'm having conversations with people, when I am about to have a one-to-one with someone who has been oppositional towards me around a series of things. I feel it in my body. I feel my face get hot, my heart beat faster. I was on a very tumultuous campaign recently around policing and public safety, where I was constantly doing debates with people in opposition to me. And I would constantly feel in the pit of my stomach this burning sensation. And I actually was feeling pain often, right? And so there are practices within that book that I absolutely love that are about regrounding yourself. That it may have been my body reacting to something that happened years ago, but it is coming up now, feeling like I'm in danger and feeling like I'm in immediate danger, even if I'm physically not in danger in this moment, right? And so I do think that I know part of this question is how can you have these healthy conversations and take care of yourself, right? Is making those very calculated decisions. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and Ohio is a very different place than Minnesota in a lot of ways. But I realized when I came to Minnesota that I had gone through a series of what I would call racial battle fatigue, where I had built up walls over time in my interactions with white people because I was so used to microaggressions and like having to constantly make mental calculations. Is this worth me responding to? When someone tells me you're very articulate, do they really mean that? Would they tell a white person that? Is it, and it's like, should I say something? No, I shouldn't, and having to do that all the time when your brain is constantly going, is this something a white person would have to deal with? Am I overreacting? Am I being sensitive? And so recognizing I had to like start to burn a lot of that off when I came to Minnesota, when I have white colleagues and white folks in my very close circle who want to have really engaging interactions around race and justice, and I want to engage. And so I have to be healthy in order to do that. And I encourage folks to be healthy in having these interactions and conversations. And if they're not in a healthy place, like to check in with their body, recognize that, like, you know what, I think it's best we not converse about this right now.
Thank you for that. Very, very good tips. And as we continue to talk about these tips, let's spend some time to continue to look into that. What are some skills? What are some techniques? And you both share some just right now. What can people do to engage in these conversations? And again, what are some healthy boundaries? I think boundaries are very critical in this conversation, because I know for a fact, sometimes, you are engaging with people and that have ideologies that don't share your values or may not even see you as a person in reality. So how do we talk about keeping that safety, those boundaries, and still engaging? And if you both can share some of those things that people can use. And we'll start with you, Howie.
Okay, yeah, Blanca, just another great question. And what I'd like to start off with is simply to think to question what kind of conversation am I having? Am I having a conversation with somebody whose goal is to win, whose goal is to demonstrate that their collection of social identities is distinctive, or is distinct and different than mine, such that they can reap the benefits of positive distinctiveness? Or are they having a conversation because their minds are open and their egos, which is all about what social identity theory is about, are not so central? And I think that something JaNaé said, which is let's not, is something that we all have to think about, because many of the conversations that we end up having, I think we walk away and we think this wasn't productive. The person wasn't interested in the substance of the issue. The person was interested in winning, beating me. And I think we need to start by thinking one thing, and I have this in all the syllabi in my classes, and I have to refer to it over and over again, not that students are violating this, but that our political opponents are not crazy, they're not evil, and they're not stupid. And these are the kinds of things that we automatically think. And then we read those words, crazy, or just crazy, or evil, they're evil. And we hear it from both sides. And I think we need to find somebody. I have somebody, and I have more than one person, because I'm in politics and meet a lot in political science, but I have a person that I talk to on an almost daily basis who's really smart and who I really respect and who disagrees with everything that I hold to be near and dear. And I have realized, just through talking to him, having that positive affect in a conversation with someone who I deeply disagree with allows me to respect that person's views. And it has changed my mind on many, many things, because I have learned that that I don't know everything, that there's more for me to learn. And so I think the big distinction here is whether I'm trying to beat a person in a conversation to win, right, such that my social identity goals can be gratified, or whether I'm really interested in having a conversation to better understand other viewpoints. And I think you have to be very intentional that that's your goal, because if not, I think our tendency as human beings, when we are in a strong intergroup, conflictual moment, tend to be those related to social identity and not to understanding.
Thank you. Great advice. JaNaé, what are some skills, some techniques that people can use to have these conversations?
Yeah, I totally agree that, it's way too often we get into conversations where we're listening to respond and not listening to understand. And so it's definitely always a beautiful listening skill to actually listen to what the person is saying and not just like waiting to respond with, wait, but I think da 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 da. But I do want to kind of go back to the original way that you asked the question, where it was like people who don't share your values, who may be ideologically different than you. I think it is a different thing. I think that if I were to engage with someone who I know for sure had a different ideological stance than I did, I would immediately use race class narrative with them. And it is a way for me to be like in an emotionally grounded place where I can name some shared values that we probably do share, where I can name the ways in which I have seen those values violated and who has been the violator, and naming the ways in which I think we can move forward when we don't allow those violations to continue. And if if that person is actually in a position where they're also listening to understand, I think then we can actually have a conversation. If it gets to a point where they, it is very clear that that is not what they came for. They came to win an argument, as opposed to having a healthy conversation. Then that is a point where I'm like, well, it looks like we're going to have to agree to disagree on this one and call it a day, and not necessarily continue, this knife fight, because it usually it's not productive. You do walk away feeling, I mean, at least for me, I feel drained after having that kind of interaction. And so, and I can't imagine it's one that's particularly healthy for who I'm talking to either. So yeah, those are definitely, the techniques for sure for me is the way in which I would engage in that.
Thank you so much. So we do have one last question that we're gonna get from the audience. Kate Wagner is going to be asking that question, and I'll just be keeping track since we do have 5 minutes left, and I wanna make sure that we respect everyone's time, including the panelists. So Kate, go ahead and ask the question from the audience.
Yes, so I appreciate how much you guys have spoken about finding those shared values and finding that space to communicate with people who disagree with you. So I wanted to direct this audience question to you both. The correlation between rising partisanship and diverging views on societal equity, that society should be structured as either hierarchical or ordered, or inclusive or egalitarian, is hard to ignore. Interactions around politics and society with family, friends, and coworkers who see things differently are more difficult. Can we work around this divergence, or do we need to confront it head on?
JaNaé, you can go ahead and get us started.
Yes, I am going to tell you to do the most un-Minnesotan thing ever and to confront it head on. So I know that is like, that gets all of the Minnesota nice feels and the passive aggressiveness. But the reality is from what we've seen in the research again is, now when I say like confront it head on, I mean, don't shy away from like talking about your values. Don't shy away from talking about the things that you care about, the things that you are for. That's a big thing. I think way too often in these like conversations, in these like Twitter fights, right? It actually just turns into a big debate about what I'm against, what I don't like, what I hate, what I want to destroy, what I want to dismantle. That isn't as productive, but leaning full on into what you're for. I am about having a thriving, healthy community. I'm about all of us being safe, no matter what we look like, where we live, what the color of our skin is. I am absolutely for us having a healthcare system that makes it possible for people to go to the doctor when they're sick and get to go in order to stay well, and this shouldn't be contingent on how much little money they have in their pocket, right? Those are things that we should be full on leaning into and not shying away from. Now, when it comes to the what we hate, what we want to destroy, what we think is toxic and terrible, like that's again is why it's useful to have like the villain language in terms of the ways the violations are happening. But I think avoiding it, not talking about it, sweeping it under a rug is, I think, just going to continue this like nasty cycle of people really just holding that in their minds and their bodies, spewing it out all over the internet. But I don't think that is the place where we need to be, or how we'll get to where we need to be.
Thank you, JaNaé. Howie?
I'm going to take this more from an academic angle than a practitioner one. And that is to say that I think what is real that's happening, and I've characterized a lot of what we hold substantively to be somewhat vacuous, as we're just taking party cues. If the party said something different, well, we would take those and we don't hold them really deeply. But one thing that I think is happening is demographic change and cultural change. So cultural change is coming from younger generations, from millennials and from Gen Z, and demographic change is coming such that whites will no longer be a majority by about 2042, but not just about race. Gender roles are changing, and the dominance of Christians over non-Christians is changing too. And so what we're having here is a moment of dynamism and a redistribution of prestige in society. Okay, so people that are white, Christian, and male, right, step into this world, even in 2022, with greater prestige than people that have other, and I would add heterosexual, than people that have other gender, sexual orientation, race, and religious backgrounds. And so what we are seeing, and I think this was made most salient in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president, which kind of inaugurated backlash in the form of the Tea Party, which was pretty much about racial backlash. And that is real, and I'm pessimistic about the next period in our political lives. And I think the extremes that we're seeing reflect the status threat that those people who are white, Christian, and male feel. Now, I don't want to say it's all men, it's all Christians, it's all white people. You know, we measure this, but you know, those demographic categories are proxies for how some people feel society is changing in ways that they don't like.
Well, I just gotta say this was such an amazing discussion. I really appreciate all of the questions. Thank you to our two amazing panelists for sharing their wisdom, their time, and their energy with us today. We will be sharing the recording of this session with everyone. I will make sure that we ask the panelists to see if they feel comfortable sharing their information. And I know that Minister JaNaé Bates also had some information to share regarding some training sessions that they lead. So we'll make sure that we have all of those questions and all of those, we have copies of them, and we'll make sure we answer them to the best of our ability. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful.
Thank you.